Hi, this is a video about the exact international and historical relationship between Greenland and Denmark. First, we must clearly establish that the Danish kingdom, in addition to Denmark itself, consists of the Faroe Islands and Greenland. In this video, I'll stick to the relationship between Denmark and Greenland, but the main content of this video applies also to the Faroe Islands. I think many people are probably surprised that Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom. First of all, I'd like to thank the Danish Conservative member of the parliament, Rasmus Jarlov, whose explanations have been a great help for me. Greenland belongs to Denmark for historical reasons. This is almost always the case with territorial areas that belong to a state. First of all, I must explain and to some extent also apologize for the expression Greenland belongs to Denmark. Of course it does not. We have an international principle of the right of peoples to self-determination. It has roots back to the American Declaration of Independence and was strongly asserted by President Wilson in peace negotiations after World War I and led, among other things, to the referendums in 1920 on Slesvig's affiliation, where the so-called First Sohn voted to go back to Denmark. The principle has since been repeated in 1945 in the UN Charter and has, among other things, formed the international legal basis for the transition of the former colonies to independence. The principle is good, as all historical experience shows that if a people is forced to live in a nation with a different majority population, unrest, rebellion, and war almost always follows. It should be noted, however, that another international legal principle ensures the territorial integrity of all nations. That is, borders may not be changed by force, but can and should still be changed peacefully through referendums. In this connection, it should be mentioned that Denmark recognized the principle of self-determination in relation to Greenland. Just read Section 21 of the Self-Government Act, which was passed in 2009. The law recognizes that the Greenlanders are an independent people with their own culture and language. When I say that Greenland is part of Denmark, I am only talking about the purely international and constitutional law. Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom, and it has been so for a very long time, formally speaking exactly in 645 years, more than twice as long as the United States has existed. It started in 1985 when the Viking Erik the Red and his crew came from Norway, Iceland to Greenland and settled there. His son, Leif the Happy, Leif den Lykkelige in Danish, also discovered America. The Norse settles on the west coast of Greenland in two settlements, Vesterbygden and Østerbygden, the western village and the eastern village. Around the year 1000 they adopted Christianity. When the Norsemen were at their highest, it is estimated that there were around 3,000 people. There was even a bishop at one time, and we can still see many remains of churches, farms and other buildings, ruins that are now managed and preserved as ancient monuments. You can read about the experiences of the Norsemen in the Icelandic sagas, the Greenlanders saga and the saga of Life So Happy, although they are hardly historically credible. They do contain some truth. With the settlement of the Vikings, Greenland became part of Iceland, which in turn became part of Norway, and in 1380 Norway entered into a union with Denmark, and from that year Greenland was governed by the Danish king or the Danish government from Copenhagen. It is important to state that when the Norsemen came to Greenland in 985, the land was empty. No people lived there, including no Inuit people. Certainly, finds show that the Inuit had settlements further north twice, but it was long before, and they disappeared again, most recently about year 900, and they were not at all the ancestors of the current Inuit people. They came approximately year 1200 from Siberia via Canada to Thule in North Greenland. Unnoticed, they slowly pushed south and only met the Norse in 1450, where both these peoples discovered that they were not alone. The Norse disappeared later. The last written sign of life we have from them was that some of them were guests at a wedding in Iceland in 1492. Why they disappeared is somewhat of a mystery. Perhaps they were driven out by the Inuit people or abducted by Muslim pirates. Although it sounds completely crazy, it had happened in other parts of the Danish kingdom, namely both in Iceland and in the Faroe Islands. It may also have been disease or climate changes that made them leave. When the Vikings came, it was so warm in Greenland that they could grow grain, but in the 15th century the climate got worse and worse, so perhaps they simply returned to Iceland and Norway, just quite slowly. And as I said, Denmark had made a union with Norway in 1380, and thus gained via Norway ownership of Greenland, the Faroe Islands and Iceland. In the period 1492 to 1721, there was only limited contact with Greenland. King Christian IV sent 2 English-hired expeditions to Greenland with Danish participants in 1605 and 1606, and in 1690-20 an expedition with the Danish captain and explorer Jens Munk came to Greenland. A fantastic story, by the way, which we will skip here. In 1721, the Danish government sent the Norwegian priest Hans Egede to Greenland together with his wife Gertrud and his 2 sons Niels and Paul, and with a number of others. Hans Egede's task was to run a Christian mission in Greenland. He is sometimes referred to as Greenland's apostle. Hans Egede's children, not least the 2 sons, played with the Greenlandic children and quickly learned Greenlandic. Their father never became completely good at the language. He landed at present-day Nuuk, which thus became the first so-called Danish colony. Hans Egede founded the first Greenlandic seminary to train Greenlandic priests, and wrote several catechisms and translated part of the Bible into Greenlandic, just as he taught the Greenlanders to read and write. He is thus the father of the Greenlandic written language. His son Niels in particular continued his father's work, and the descendants of the Egede family can still be found in Greenland. However, the well-known Greenlandic former Prime Minister Mute B. Egede, despite his surname, is not related to Hans Egede. Since 1721, there has been a permanent Danish presence in Greenland, where more and more colonies was gradually established. just as the Greenlanders increasingly settled in these settlements more or less permanently. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, Denmark had to cede Norway to Sweden, but Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Iceland remained in Denmark. Roughly speaking, Danish colonial policy was that the Greenlanders should be trappers and fishermen and sell their skins and other goods, whales, etc., to the Royal Greenlandic Trade Company, and they should buy fuel for lighting and cooking, guns, cartridges, and coffee, and so on, and they should learn to read and write, but preferably only read the Bible and Christian hymns. In fact, the ability to read and write Greenlandics was already on the rise, and in 1861 Greenland's first newspaper, Atugatli Utit, I apologize for the pronunciation, but it means distributed reading material, and it was published and sent free of charge to the towns of the west coast. A large part of the population could read at this time, and many of the articles and debates were written in Greenlandic, both by and about Greenlanders. The newspaper exists to this day as a part of the Greenlandic media group Sermitsiaq. Incidentally, Danish ownership of Greenland has been contested 3 times in recent times, 4 with Trump's, but I'll only mention the first 3 times. 1 by the United States in the early 1900s, partly because the American polar explorer Peary had traveled around North Greenland. He probably later turned out to be a fraud who lied about having reached the North Pole. In connection with the sale of the Virgin Islands to the United States in 1916, Denmark received a declaration from the U.S. government signed by Secretary of State Mr. Lansing, in which the U.S. recognizes Denmark's right to all of Greenland. The text for this declaration can be read via a link in the explanation to this video. And the second time Denmark's rights were contested was by Norway in 1931 to 32, when Norwegian trappers settled in East Greenland and declared it Norwegian territory with the argument that it was empty land. The International Court of Justice in The Hague ruled this dispute in Denmark's favor. And for the third time, to some content, in the period 1940 to 45, when the Danish ambassador in Washington, Henrik Kaufmann, gave the USA the right to use Greenland for, among other things, to air transport from the US to Europe, and the extraction of cryolite to use in the production of aluminium. Since the connection and supply line to Denmark had been interrupted due to the German occupation of Denmark. As early as 1921, Greenlandic elected land councils had been established, which were adversary in relation to the Danish administration of the colony. These land councils replaces the first democratic initiatives in Greenland, namely the so-called trusteeships for East settlements, which was established in 1857. And it was precisely the land councils that came to play a major role during the Second World War, as they were giving far greater power. There was, as I said, no connection to Copenhagen. The top Danish official, Eske Brun, was, by the way, the right man the right man in the right position, as he respected the Greenlanders' self-determination to a greater extent than was usual, and ensured that supplies from the USA were coordinated and distributed in the best possible way. He also helped together with local Greenlanders and American soldiers to destroy the Nazi German weather stations on the east coast. After the war, it was clear that Greenland could not return to the previous form of Danish administration, which was mainly based on maintaining a society of hunters and fishermen. Therefore, the Danish side began to invest large resources in making Greenland a modern society, and this led to Greenland in 1953, when Denmark adopted a new constitution, going from colonial status to being a part of Denmark. This incorporation of Greenland into Denmark was of course also a kind of conquest or annexation, which advocates of independence in Greenland today also emphasize and add that there was never a referendum on whether the Greenlanders now also wanted to be a part of Denmark. This is true, but it must be added that the arrangement was unanimously approved by the Land Council, the highest elected assembly in Greenland at the time. The United Nations also approved the transition of Greenland to this new status. However, it quickly became clear that the conditions in Greenland were so different from those in Denmark that the two countries and peoples could not and should not be harmonized and made equal and made the same. Therefore, in 1979, the so-called Home Rule Act was passed, and later in 2009, the Greenlandic Self-Government Act, which stated that the Greenlandic people are a people under international law with the right to self-determination. The Act grants self-government to a wide range of internal conditions and allows for the Greenlandic self-government to take over a number of additional powers if it wishes. And they had done so to a certain extent, but there is still parts that they have not wanted to take over. When Greenland, and in section 21 of this Self-Government Act, it is stated that the decision of Greenland's independence shall be made by the Greenlandic people. When Greenland is therefore still a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, it is not because the Greenlanders are forced to be so. They simply have not yet taken up the offer of independence. The situation is therefore current, with Greenland itself having control over all matters except for those who are still handled by Denmark. And it is, I'll mention the most important issues handled by Denmark. It is the police and judiciary things. The Danish Supreme Court is, for instance, also Greenland's highest court, and the currency, we use Danish banknotes in Greenland, also foreign policy and defense. Finally, there is a common constitution, the Danish constitution, which means, among other things, that there are two Greenlandic members of the Danish parliament, Folketinget, as we call it. And then citizenship and passport are common. This means that Danes who travel to Greenland and Greenlanders who travel to Denmark enjoy all rights in a completely equal way. You are thus entitled to social benefits, free education and free treatment in hospitals, which many Greenlanders benefit from, for example, when they take their higher education or are treated at the Danish National Hospital. To sum it up, according to international law, Greenland is not an independent country. The Danish government and the Danish constitution apply, but almost all local decisions are delegated to the self-government of Greenland, and in our time we refer to Greenland as a country with its own language, culture, etc., and try to respect them as such, which may sometimes fail, I'll admit. But I think the majority of Danish now respect the Greenlandic people very deeply. I'll conclude my presentation by clarifying the fact that all inhabitants of Greenland are Danish citizens and therefore cannot be abandoned by the government of the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is obliged, according to its constitution, to defend Greenland and the rights of the Greenlandians with all the means at our disposal, as long as they have not taken up Denmark's offer of independence. And I'll say with regards, Thorkil Sohn, I'm a former headmaster of a boarding school for teenagers, where there, by the way, sometimes were pupils from Greenland. And I'm living in Bilsvej 266950, that's the postal code, Ringkøbing, Denmark. I hope that this video has been of interest for you. Thank you. And now I'll try to stop this video.